Okay, so what is a nation?
Oh, well, I mean, he separates it into three components.
Three
He says
components.
that it's imagined, limited, and community.
Okay, so there's a number of components to it. We've already got some of the key terms. The imagined part, we'll talk more about that. You said community and what else?
Limited.
Limited. That's another one of the vocab words I think is significant. Good. So it's multiple things. One of the things he's going to do, first of all, is not just define it, but describe it. Sometimes it's easier to give examples of something in order to get an understanding of it than it is to give a sort of dictionary definition of it. All right. Good. That's a good start. Anyone else? What else is a nation? What does he say a nation is? How does he describe a nation? Let's get some of this on the board so we can unpack it. Take a guess.
Sovereign.
Sovereign is another big word.
Sovereign.
It's an interesting word because we come across the word sovereign in several different contexts. Many of them don't fit the United States. A sovereign in sort of ancient times was the king or the queen. That was the sovereign, the leader. That's where all the authority in the society stood. The king or the queen was the law. But in the United States, you don't have a king or a queen. You don't have a monarchy. This country is going to be set up differently. It actually purposely distanced itself from the old world in terms of having a sovereign. But he's saying the nation is still seen as sovereign. The nation is the authority, even though it's supposedly set up around a republic or a democratic society, not a monarchy. That there's still some power or authority in the nation itself. There's some power there, and the law still functions even though it's not through the voice of a king or a queen. Sovereign, you can kind of use that also as independent. A nation wants to be sovereign. One nation doesn't want to be told what to do by another nation. Nations don't like that. Barack Obama cannot make a $20 minimum wage in Mexico. He can't decree the minimum wage now in Mexico is $20. Can't do it. He's not in charge of Mexico or Canada. He's in charge of the United States. Nations want to be sovereign. Sometimes nations go to war because they feel like their sovereignty is being attacked, impacted. Anything else? What else do we get from nation? You can use some more of the terms here, or you can reflect on anything that struck you.
I was just gonna say, like, I was gonna expand on like imagine.
Okay,
This is
good.
an imagined community because most of the members of that community will never actually see the rest of their so-called like nation.
Okay.
So that's why it's like an imagined community.
Yeah, this term imagined is an interesting one. It's good that two of you already have focused on it. It stands out, and it should stand out for certain reasons. When we usually think about imagination, imagining something, we usually think of something that's not real, right? I'm imagining that there's a little mini pink elephant in the corner. Right? I see him, he's a little cute thing. Oh, peanut. I may imagine that he's there. You guys don't see him. You're like, okay, what's going on, right? We usually imagine something or speak of it as something that's not there. That's not what he's necessarily saying about a nation, but in part it is. He's saying, look, we create something, we imagine it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have real power. That doesn't mean it doesn't have real implications. So just because, I see this elephant here, you all don't. All of a sudden you heard something run and hit me, knock me down, you're like, whoa, I didn't see it, but it had some kind of power. And he's saying the nations are kind of like that in a sense. You don't see them in a tangible way all the time, but they're always sort of functioning. They always have power in a sense. Your reference to this quote is also a good one. I think it's one of the quotes I pulled out, right? Yeah, on page 7. You jump to the end. Good. The nation is imagined. No, that's not the one I want. Should have worn my glasses today. What was the quote you gave again about not seeing all its fellow members? Give me that quote again about not seeing all your fellow members.
Oh, it's literally page 6.
Okay.
At the beginning it said that it is imagined because members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them. Yet in the minds of each one,
Image of their community. So think about this in the context of the United States, or what, 308, 310 million Americans documented in this country, right? Citizenship, forms and such. Do you know all 308 million Americans? Does that make you any less American? No. Yet, Americans feel like they have something in common with all 308 million. That's part of the imagination. We feel like you have something in common because of this quote-unquote common identity. Whether you live in Montana or Washington, D.C. or California or New York, right? And part of nationalism has always involved a kind of geographical space too, a land. Land is really important historically. Look at a lot of the wars and conflicts that we come into studying in history, and a lot of them have to do with land, boundaries, geography, these types of things. So this imagine stuff is important. Right? You imagine a connection. Kind of like a us versus them mentality in some ways. This can be a good or a bad thing. We can have our own nation right here. When is this, 210? We could be humanity's 210. Come up with a little flag, says 210 on it. Close the door. Defend ourselves if attacked by 209 over there. This us versus them mentality is interesting because just because we've hung out now for, an hour and a half, we feel like we have something in common with each other. If they invade like all of a sudden, say we're 40 minutes into class, and somebody comes in and they seem like they don't fit, everybody kind of, who is this? Who's this outsider? Right? All of a sudden it feels like, why is this person invading our space? Again, this can function in good or bad ways. They've entered our nation. Right? We declared it a nation, we made it a nation, and now someone else is coming in and it feels funny. It's the same way when you think about smaller forms of communities like neighborhoods, families, somebody that doesn't seem to fit. This is also function in terms of things like race. Right? Notions of racism or xenophobia, a fear of the other, a fear of an outsider. Class. Well, all these lower-class folks move it into our neighborhood and ruin it. Right? Gender. So there's a club and it's all women, and all of a sudden, dude walks into the club. It feels different. What's he doing? Or vice versa. The conversation might change. This community concept is something we understand even without defining it. He's going to say that nations are kind of like really big communities in many ways. Anything else?
On the limited component, the way he talks about it, says that kind of the way that nations work is that each nation feels like kind of like the individualistic, unique thing. So like you would think that each one would want. What does he say? He says like even like when it comes to religion, like you would expect them to want to encompass the whole human race, but
Good.
the way that nations thrive is that they kind of like so what you're saying is they want to stay separate because they feel like they're kind of like even under the sovereign, like they are the true sovereign in that particular. So it's kind of like divisive in the sense that you're not looking for you're not looking for I guess a worldwide unity. You're looking to keep that distinction.
Good. The limited is important, and this is really where he starts. I told you how he starts talking all over the place about Marxism and world revolution, Vietnam, Cambodia. He's really doing that to set up this limited point, that nations don't make sense in some ways in the 21st century. We thought we were beyond nations. We thought nationalism was over. We got the internet, right? I can stream something to China right now. National borders don't necessarily stop that. In some places they stop the internet, but European Union, right? This is a combination of nations. A credit card, I can buy something somewhere in Scandinavia right now. Right? This is a different time than historically where national borders seem to be more concrete. Music, culture, right? You can watch American television shows around the world. Culture especially is something that has become very international. In fact, I had a chance to hang out with Benedict Anderson a while back, and the class he was teaching was post-nationalism, this idea that the nation was over. But the conclusion we came to was, no, it's not. You try to travel. Make sure you have your passport, right? All of a sudden you might feel a little differently when you step outside U.S. borders. That nations still seem to matter even though we didn't think they would.
It still seems like it's still, like you're saying, it's more upfront. Especially now, because you're saying the internet and all that, it's actually more upfront because where before we weren't even thinking about it, whatever. Now that we can see it, and now that we can, like you said, if you can watch a show or something from a different country, be like, you might be sitting here, be like, that's weird.
Mm. You feel it more. You can see it.
Feel
It feels more tangible.
Even though you're here, where
Okay.
before you had to travel
That's true too.
out there
That's true.
and see it and feel it. And you know, when I came here, I felt like an outsider because I was like, you know, I'm from the Dominican Republic, so I'm like, okay, now I'm in New York. What the hell? And I felt weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You had some sense of that immediately. It's interesting, and again, a lot of what you said, it's unconscious. This limited part is really, I'm going to show you my artistic skills real quick. Now, don't laugh. That's my United States. Don't laugh. That's free. This art class today, that's free. United States. The limited point that you're making is an important one. Think about borders. Right? Above the United States is what?
Canada.
Down below, right over here?
Mexico.
Limited. Nationalism wouldn't make sense if there were no borders. Right? If there was just one globe and everybody was, maybe that'd be a great thing. And he contrasts that with, say, world religions, right? That don't want to care so much about national borders, perhaps, or other international movements. He's saying they exist. There are international issues and problems. World pollution, for example, has to be an international issue in many ways because air pollution doesn't stop at the border. Right? Canada's tore up. It's not going to say, oh, it's the U.S. Let's go ahead and the air is going to turn around and go back, right? So some nations have to cooperate in these ways. But this is all about the limited part. There's still borders that matter. My house, I grew up in San Diego, California, right here. My mom's house is 7 miles from the border with Mexico. To be in Mexico in 10 minutes. Did I feel any less American? Because I'm 3,000 miles away from D.C. and 10 miles to the next country? No. Logically, that doesn't make any sense. Right? Culturally, I should have been much more Mexican in my cultural affinities. But nationalism isn't always about logic. It isn't always about logic. These limits make sense. These limits make sense. Doesn't necessarily matter if you live in Pennsylvania, New York, Florida, Washington, California, Montana, some up here, Texas. That's supposed to be Texas, sorry. But that's the limited point he's making, and that's where he starts this article, because like Marxism and Marxism itself is an international ideology. Right? Marxism was about the workers rising up and overthrowing, those that oppressed them as workers. Didn't matter if you're a worker in the United States or a steel mill in Russia or what have you. Workers were supposed to rise up according to Marxist theory. It was an international theory. And Ben Attiana said, well, that's not really how it went down. It still seems to be more about national identity, for better or for worse. And so he's trying to understand that. Good stuff. Good start. It's a picture of Ben Anderson. I told you, he talks like Yoda. When I went to hang out with him, and I was really interested in nationalism. He's like the man on nationalism. So I'm like, I'm going to go talk to this guy. He teaches at Cornell. And, there's like 20 of us there, and we're asking him, so what's a nation? You're Yoda, tell us. He wouldn't tell us. He really just answered our questions with questions. Like, what's a nation? What do you think it is? I'm trying to be a nationalism Jedi. Like, help me out. He wouldn't tell us. He's like, it doesn't matter what I think. What do you think? So that's the same thing I'm doing to you guys. Some key terms. We've seen some of these already. You all pulled out some of these already. There are some synonyms: patriotism, like a loyalty. Most of the time when folks study nationalism, like traditionally when folks said nationalism, they sort of meant relationships between governments. So state one versus state two, how do they interact? So the United States president, calls up the leader in France, and they have a conversation about trade or what have you. Normally one government talking to another government. Often that's involved war. Right? One nation going to war. Anderson says that's true, but that's not really where the power is. He's not so much interested in the state-to-state relationship. He's more interested in the relationship between individuals and their nations. Why do you as an individual feel such a connection to your identity, your national identity, American identity, let's say in this case? say you don't live in the maybe for us it's easier. We're what, half hour from the president's house. We're closer to D.C. We're closer to kind of the center of power in a sense in this nation. What if you live in Montana? Never been to D.C. He's like, why do people feel such a connection, even though they're so far from the center of power? Why did I feel such a connection when I'm 3,000 miles away in San Diego? I'm nowhere near D.C. up here. It's not just about distance, he would say. Question?
Yeah, I was actually
comment?
going to ask you if you feel like the sense of nationalism in areas like San Diego, where you're from, is, I mean, that's going to be like individual to individual, but usually a sense of nationalism in areas that are close to other countries, just because there's a lot of like different immigrants and people of different like races there, it tends to be like, I can't speak for everyone, but a little bit less.
Okay.
Then like if you were to go to like Kansas, where everyone's like, oh, I'm purebred American, American of the day, I doubt it. As
More
you go to San Diego, you'll be like, I feel more Hispanic, even though I'm like Mexican, even though my parents or grandparents were the only ones that like lived there.
It's a good point. There are regional differences. There are local differences. Places like San Diego are much more diverse racially in immigration status than some other places. That's definitely true. And sometimes this happens in a kind of negative sense, too. There's a tremendous fear in a place like San Diego of immigrants, illegal immigration who can take over, blah, blah, blah. Some of that can be racist. Some of that can be a fear of the other. Some of that can be classist. So it can work both ways in terms of other factors that may impact national identity. Race, class, gender being three of the important ones. Religion might be one. All sorts of things that come under this kind of umbrella of nationalism. Nationalism is kind of like the term culture. Everything can kind of really fit up in there. So it's a huge, broad term.
Oh, well, I was just gonna say, like, I think the problem is that what does it mean to be an American? Because I think that's one of the main problems with this country. Like, there's some people who say, oh, you're American if you're born here. Okay, so what about naturalized citizens?
Yeah.
And then what about people who, for instance, ambassadors who maybe were born abroad? Like, okay, so what about where your parents were? Because technically you are what your parents are because that's the DNA and that's what you have. But then if you were born somewhere else, like that, and so I feel like that's the problem with America. We want to act like it's a melting pot, but it's really a salad.
Interesting. And this is a complicated thing about not only the United States, but about this idea of democracy generally. We'll get more into that, too.
It's like what you said even though people consider themselves, like you said, oh, they consider themselves Hispanic, even though you said only their parents and grandparents live there. But that's, at least I know, like for us, you're like, you are what your parents are. So like, that's why I feel like a lot of people who maybe can only trace their roots here, they don't understand the importance of culture. And like,
Culture
that's something
definitely
that's
comes into
missing
it.
in America. You guys can't trace your roots back, and so you kind of feel like America, that's the last thing that you guys remember. So that's what you cling on to, even though America isn't really easily definable.
Not at all. Probably one of the more complicated places. I think America's a land of immigrants, right?
Exactly.
So it's interesting that you'd raise this term of American. Sometimes it depends on when you immigrated.
But people like people who are the ones who are like, oh, I'm pure American, are the ones who are normally like look down on the whole immigrants because they're like, well, you aren't really American, you weren't born here, but it's like, do you even forget, like you said, America was founded by immigrants. So
Interesting phenomenon about immigration. Folks have immigrated in waves to this country since it's, before its founding, in fact. Yet one of the most rapid ways that they've become American, for better or for worse, is to look down on other immigrants that come. So it's interesting that, most immigrants come in the 20th century. The largest, immigrant groups have come since the 20th century, and then there was a huge immigration wave in the 1890s that were called new immigrants, right? Because the earlier wave in the 1850s, mostly German and Irish, for example, Chinese on the West Coast. And then in the 1890s, you had Southern and Eastern Europeans coming. And these immigrants that have been here 40 years now looked at these Italians and Jews and they're like, they're not Americans. They weren't even considered really white in the same sense. So in some ways, becoming American was about the whole us versus them. We've been here now, we're invested. What are these new folks going to bring to it? And the newest immigrants are always kind of looked down on in an interesting way. So what does it mean to be an American? If you came in the 1890s, maybe you are Italian American or what have you. Good chance that your ancestors came in the 1890s. Yet there were slaves here since the 1600s. Might have been here 200 years longer, yet they're seen as outsiders. These African American descendants or Mexican American descendants who actually had the border move around them, right? They were in California was Mexico, so they might have lived here for generations before it became the United States. This is the imagination, right? When it's reimagined as the United States, all that changes. Not logical in any sense at all. Like literally the border moved around them. One of the first things on the first day when I was in Anderson's class, he put that term American on the board. I'm like, okay, and then he put this term on the board. It's like, what is that? M-U-R-K-A. We were sitting there for a while, quiet. We're like, what is that? He's like, Merca. Okay, what's Merca? That's it. He said, Cornell is in Ithaca, New York, upstate New York. He said, this is how people say it here, Merca. It's Merca. So he's like, and they have a certain idea about what that means, right? None of us knew what that meant because we weren't from there, but somebody local was, oh yeah, that's just how folks say America here, and that's what they kind of mean by it. Keep all this stuff in mind. I know we're throwing a lot up in the air right now. We're going to see what kind of sticks. So geography is going to be important. Boundaries and borders are important, for better or for worse. We're not even really getting into necessarily the better or for worse yet here. We're getting into the difficulty of definition, the nation as a geographical space, all that kind of stuff. I told you he starts off writing about Marxism, international stuff, in order to get at national issues. You guys have also mentioned, he talked about consciousness. Nationalism is usually not something you pay attention to, unless something happens to bring it to the forefront of your mind. National crisis is usually when you probably didn't wake up this morning and think, I got to get to class, I'm American today, right? You're like, I'm late, what's that beltway going to look like, right? They're everyday kind of things, but in moments of national crisis is when we tend to notice these things, or when you leave outside the borders of the U.S. Right? When I've traveled to Mexico, I feel very American. Like, okay, am I going to be able to get back, make sure my paperwork's cool, blah, blah, blah. And then it's usually when you're outside of the borders that you think about these things. It's interesting when it's conscious and unconscious. Go ahead.
Is this going to be anywhere?
Yeah, I'll post it up on the Blackboard as well. So you don't have to worry about writing it on there and all that. And we're going to come back to the 9/11 example. Well, let's talk about it now. 9/11, September 11th. Those of you know, now it's, 14 years ago? Goodness gracious, I'm getting old. September 11th, 2001. I was in Los Angeles to UCLA. I was actually driving to San Diego, 2 hours away, to my mom's house because I was going to fly from San Diego to D.C. My dissertation research was here at Howard University. I was going to come live here for a year. Supposed to be on a plane September 12th. So I drove down in the middle of the night because the 405 freeway in Los Angeles is kind of like the Beltway. If you can avoid rush hour, do so at all costs. So I drove down at like 2 in the morning. Got into San Diego at 4 in the morning, crawled into bed. Right before 6 a.m., I hear my mom going off. Oh my goodness, a square ward. I'm like, oh. Just went to sleep 2 hours ago. Will she shut up? I didn't say that because I'm not crazy. My mom was this big, but she catch a frying pan. No, I just wouldn't do that anyway. But yeah, I was hoping, like, I'm tired. Oh my gosh. I noticed she's still going off, and so I'm like, something happened to me. Get up and see what's happening. I get up, go in her room. She's glued to the TV. Get there in time to see the second plane hit the World Trade Center. Boom. I'm like, whoa. Yeah, that's what it seemed like. Like this, like what? I'm still, buildings come down here in New York. Stuff obviously happened in D.C., the Pentagon, plane crashed in Pennsylvania, right? My question is this. Think about Anderson, Imagine Communities, the Power of Nationalism. Why did we care? It's an attack on the nation. Right? But we were 3,000 miles away. We were safe. Right? We were cool in my mom's living room. In fact, we would have been in much more danger if someone had attacked Mexico, physically. But that didn't make us care any less, right? That didn't make us like less glued to the TV, right? Because there's a certain power to this. It's not just based on logic. In fact, some of those planes are supposed to be coming to L.A., right? But we weren't thinking about that. It was more about this, there's an attack on the nation, on the American identity at that point. Think about the power of that. Not always logical in a sense, but in other ways it's perfectly logical. There's an interesting quote here. I gave away all my hand. I think I have it here too. Skip forward a little bit. You guys have already pulled out some of these. You guys have pulled out most of these. Good job. Y'all better than anything. National crisis, 9/11. You guys already read my notes, huh? I don't have anything else to say. Now, I don't want to go there yet. There's one quote. Okay, this is quote on page 7. The power of community. My mother was she died last year. I think I said that, but she was a civil rights veteran. My mom, again, she's 5'2", but she was serious. She went to jail 9 times in the 1960s for marching and whatnot with Martin Luther King and others. Nonviolent protests. She got beat up, by the police and thrown in jail, that kind of stuff. So she was always kind of hesitant growing up about telling me certain things, like if you get in trouble, call the police, but be careful. That was one of her lessons. And I'm like, what are you talking about? What does that mean? She was very interested in issues of equality, especially racial equality, gender, that kind of stuff. Yet, on the morning of September 11th, her phrase was, we are being attacked. We've been attacked. Mom, that was in some ways is very critical of, American history. She taught American history for 40 years. She knew it, the dark side as well as its positives. Yet, at that moment, she says, we're under attack. She thought I was going to get drafted and all kind of stuff like that, right? This quote makes you think of that. Finally, it is imagined as a community because regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each, the nation is always conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. Nice language, complicated a little. What's he saying here? Let's break this down.
I feel like what he's saying is, it doesn't matter like with all the problems that we have. It's almost like I would say I'm gonna take it to like the military.
Okay,
So,
good.
me in the Army and somebody else in the Marines, we might have differences and we make fun of each other and da da da.
Right.
But then when we get attacked, we turn around and be like, okay, we've been attacked by this person.
Right. Put all that aside.
Yeah, we put all that aside, and then we take care of that.
That's interesting. Branches of the armed forces were worked out. You could even think family, right? Siblings. You might fight like cats and dogs with your brothers and sisters at home. I had stepbrothers and sisters. We'd be in the house just killing each other. I took more whoopings from them than anybody else, right? But if somebody else attacked me, oh, I was on, right? Before I could even say anything, I had to pull my brother off, right? You don't do that. Only I can beat him up. Like, what kind of sense does that make? But the family, right? Like, no stranger can attack. Nobody, no them, right? No outsiders. And that's exactly how it kind of functioned. Not that she forgot about issues of racism, but at that moment, like, okay, we need to deal with this. Then we'll go back to making the country as great as it can be. And this is part of the power that Anderson's like, wow, I mean, at least temporarily, it'll make you put other things on the side, even if you disagree. Now, nationalism, a couple things to put in here. Nationalism has it's complicated, but it leaves a bad taste in people's mouth in many cases, in part because of 20th century world history. Most of the time when folks think of nationalism now, they think of the National Socialism in Germany leading up to World War II. Right? The Nazi Party was National Socialist Party, which obviously persecuted others, right? Jews, handicapped folks, everybody basically, except Aryans they didn't like. Right? And that was nationalism in service of the nation, all that kind of stuff. Hitler was able to really mold a whole nation of people to do some pretty bad things. Good point. Think about the imagination there, right? We need to be blonde hair, blue eyed. Did anybody have a mirror in Germany? Was Hitler blonde or blue eyed? So it's interesting, again, the power of this imagination. Right? But what he was able to do was mobilize a whole bunch of folks, scapegoat groups of people, the reason why you're poor, this and that, blah, 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 and get folks to do some amazing things, amazingly destructive things. Right, so normally when folks talk about nationalism, you think about the dangers of it, the excess of it. People can do some crazy things in groups especially. Individuals sometimes act okay, but when we get crowds, sometimes, it seems like the lowest common denominator may come out. So be careful of that when you're thinking about or reading something on nation, because that's normally what people immediately think of. You shouldn't think about that, but there are other. Nationalism also has been in the 20th century. Freedom fighters on the African continent or Asia, Latin America, fighting for their nation, right, to no longer be colonies. It's the same idea about galvanizing a nation behind an idea. Just be careful of what the idea is. This last quote is interesting too. I want to pull this one out and see what you guys think of it. I usually kind of end with this one. When he's talking about the power of nationalism, I think this one is an interesting one. Ultimately, it is this fraternity that makes it possible over the past 2 centuries, this kind of touches on the German thing, for so many millions of people, not so much to kill, you understand that, as willingly to die for such limited imaginings. But starting at the end, he's saying, yeah, it's limited in a sense, like it's not universal, but there's a tremendous power there. I think his example is interesting. Use the term fraternity. We know what fraternity generally means. On a college campus, it usually means a social organization around something, fraternity, sorority, right, male, female. But generally, the term just means brotherhood, like a brotherhood of some type. So it's this fraternity that makes it possible over the past 200 years for so many millions of people, not so much to kill as willingly to die. Now, this always struck me. I think even the most peaceful person, there might be a handful of things you might be willing to kill for, right? Maybe. I mean, if you had to. I say you're a peaceful person generally, but you join the military, you might be asked to kill, right? Or there might be some things. I don't want to get too crass, but I feel like I'm a pretty calm person. But there's probably 10 things I could see myself killing for. Don't tell nobody. But there might be 10 things, right? That's not the example, though, he thinks is most powerful. He says even more than that, because it would take something. It would take something for me to do that. But even higher than that, a level of commitment higher than that would be, what are you willing to die for? And if there are 10 things you're willing to kill for, there's probably only 2 or 3 you're willing to die for. Let's look at it another way. If there are 10 people you're willing to kill for, like, look, he said, kill him, I got to kill him. There might only be 2 or 3. Like, you did something to my mom, I got to kill you, I'm sorry. My sister lives here in D.C. If you mess with her, you can have this job, because I got to kill you. But think, I'm just joking, sort of. But I think the example is interesting, right? There are probably fewer things you'd be willing to literally give your life for. If you know, look, if I die, everybody else will be okay. That's a high level of commitment, right? He says nations are that powerful. And it's like joining the military, right? You literally are signing, you might die. You know that going in.
Yeah. I had that discussion with myself when I went to Iraq. That's a discussion you had to have with yourself. I went in 2007, and it was just like a thing where I knew, like, and here's the crazy part. I wasn't even born here, and then I joined the military, and then people always ask me, like, how can you join if you're not American? You're not born here. You could join. And I felt more American because of the whole 9/11 thing, and I've been here for a while.
Right.
Even though I wasn't born here, I wasn't a citizen yet.
Right.
I felt like
Perfect example.
I can do this, and if something happens with it, it happens. I'm good with that. And
it's patriotism. That's that's a very powerful thing. Even though there may be certain things you question about
crazy
the
you
U.S.
said that because I was like, I don't know. That's something that was in my head at that time.
How long have you been here?
I've been here since I was 5.
So do you consider yourself American?
Right now, since I did get my citizenship, yes, I do say because.
No, but like when did you consider yourself American?
When I would say
At
probably,
what point? That's an interesting question.
Like 2002.
Like you would
At
consider
that point.
yourself American when you went off, right?
When
I think
attack
it's funny that
happened.
he's saying other people's exact, and that's what Americans do. Like other people saying you're not even American. How many Americans who were born here will you find that's going to go and give their life to the country? None. Like so many of you be like, oh,
It's a rare thing. I'm a
You
coward.
go
You
and
know,
listen.
I appreciate it. I'm a coward.
I agree with that.
I don't like guns. They scare me. Had too many pointed at me in this life. I don't like them.
It's like the same becoming a citizenship. Like I know, like I had the test that they have to take is ridiculous, and like there's
Most Americans can't pass that test.
99% of actual citizens
Cannot pass it.
you wouldn't be able to pass it.
You have to
So it's kind of like
study.
this.
It's crazy. It's a really hard test.
We take our citizenship for granted, whereas other people they see the value in something because you had to like work for it.
I think a lot of people that come here and everything see this thing as becoming American and everything like this. You're like
exactly. It's like a promised land.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the people who were born in the promised land, they're like,
Take the promise for,
exactly.
they take the promise for granted in a sense.
No, because
Until it's threatened.
My parents weren't born here, but like I never, like I remember the first time I ever saw my dad shed a tear was on 9/11. Like I didn't know what was going on, and I never seen my dad cry before. And I'm like,
Well, yeah, what?
you know, and it's crazy because it's like, again, what does it mean to be American, and you know, what does that mean?
What I want you to take from this, again, there's something there are whole classes on this subject, right? You take a poli-sci class, they read this book. I've seen stuff on YouTube related to this book. What I want you to take from this is, again, this idea of a nation. We're obviously going to apply it in various contexts here in our study of U.S. history, especially early U.S. history, as we are imagining what becomes the United States. We're going to also use it on different levels, right? You could understand it on neighborhood. In the neighborhood, I live in Laurel. Right? If I had come out my house this morning and the neighbor's house was on fire, even though I'm, running late to work, I would, want to help them out, right? I don't know them, but we live in the same neighborhood. We feel like we have something in common. It's the right thing to do. Right? You feel like you know me because we've had 2 classes together now. I seem like a nice guy, right? What if somebody walked in this classroom right now, they entered our nation, Humanities 210, and smacked me in the face? I'm like, what? And I'm like, what? And they do it again. One of you might feel bad for me. You don't have to jump in or nothing. I got it. Don't worry about it. But you might feel a little bad for me, right? Like, you shouldn't have done that. He's a nice guy. Feel like, what if I was out in the student parking lot, right before class, keying cars, tired of not being able to find a parking space. Maybe I deserved it, right? Who knows? But we feel like we have something in common. We feel like we're a community, even though we may only know a little bit about each other. Somebody came in here and jumped on one of you guys. I got your back. I got your back. Don't worry about it. So it's interesting to think about this, but we want to be able to apply it. The most important thing to me is that you're able to deal with difficult arguments. This is a difficult argument. You all broke it down like nothing. But the next step is we want to be able to use it as a tool. Right? How can we use it to understand what in many ways is a complicated history that we have to deal with? Any questions about this? We'll come back to it a bit. I'm going to refer back to this really throughout the whole semester, but there are some things I did not bring up. But I think you get the point. Hopefully this gives you some sense of how to read even difficult materials like this. This next piece I want you to read is much easier to read, like I said. This is Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point. It is the introduction in chapter 1 of his book. It's not by a historian. It's by a best-selling author. Actually, there's several bestsellers. This one is, I think, particularly useful for us. Same basic questions I want you to be able to answer so we can talk about it and we can apply it, or I can start applying some of this stuff next time. Look at the title. The title is Tipping Point. I want you to be able to tell me what a tipping point is.
This is on Blackboard.
Yeah, I put it on Blackboard too. If you don't want the copy, you can give it back to me. I'll recycle it.
What's this stuff underlined?
That's just it was my copy. So.
Yeah, I had to read this for introduction to business.
Did you? Interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of business comes into it. What is a tipping point? Be able to tell me that? And think about the 3 or 4 key examples that he uses to describe what a tipping point is. And a lot of them are from more recent U.S. history, like 20th century stuff and other fields. But we're going to use this to talk about, for example, September 11th is going to be a major tipping point in U.S. history. Right? The Civil War is a huge tipping point. The Revolutionary War is a huge tipping point. So be able to tell me what is a tipping point, and then what are the 3 or 4 key examples that he uses. And we'll discuss this and apply it on Friday. All right? Thanks. See you later. And get your books, too. We'll need them next week.